Denis Healy.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, people have short memories, and it may be useful if I remind the House that in 1972, President Pompidou announced on French television that there would be a European common currency by the 31st of December 1980. The Werner Plan, from which this prediction was drawn, was wrecked by events outside Europe, partly the Nixon shocks, partly the effects of the OPEC increase in the oil price. And nobody in the House seems able to recall that it ever existed. Maastricht could suffer the same fate. I agree with all the honourable members who said that it may prove to be a major step towards a valuable goal of greater unity in Europe. But let us face the fact, it changes nothing in today's world. It didn't even attempt, the summit at Maastricht, to close any of the yawning gaps in the single market which has to come into effect at the end of next year. It simply agreed a timetable for producing a single currency at the latest by 1999, with or without Britain. But in fact, even in this area, nothing significant will change in the real world until phase 2 of the European Monetary Union takes effect in 1994, more than 3 years from now. And I want to start by asking, what are the risks that the Delors Plan, which is the origin of European Economic and Monetary Union, will suffer the same fate as the Werner Plan 20 years ago? Let us remind ourselves, as the Prime Minister wisely did in his opening speech, that the Maastricht Treaty does not come into force until more than 12 months from now, the beginning of 1993, and then only if every one of the 12 governments which initialed the treaty in Maastricht get it ratified by their parliaments. And here the real debate is only beginning. As the Prime Minister said, the British and Danish parliaments are the only parliaments which have really yet considered either European Monetary Union, as it is now drawn up, or European Political Union. And if we look at the initial response to Maastricht, the omens are not wholly encouraging. There is growing opposition now in Germany to giving up the Deutsche Mark without any real return in political union, which Chancellor Kohl had said was a precondition of moving to a single currency. And I see from today's Financial Times that a leading member of the board of the Bundesbank said yesterday that the Maastricht summit was a failure and might prove to be a suicidal failure. Now, these are serious words coming from a key member of the body which drew up the detailed proposals for European Economic and Monetary Union. And I can't resist the feeling that the extraordinary surrender of Her Majesty's government to German bullying over the recognition of Croatia yesterday had something to do with the need to appease German public opinion, which is turning nasty on the whole process. Or maybe perhaps it was just sucking up to the Honourable Lady, the member for Finchley, who has succeeded in abandoning her resistance to German blandishments and formed a common front with Chancellor Kohl in demanding the immediate and unconditional recognition of Croatia. But then it is, of course, a funny old world. Now, French ratification is little more certain, because the right wing, the extreme right, under Le Pen, is campaigning very hard in France against what they inelegantly call the federasts of the European movement. And Le Pen may succeed in winning allies in the more moderate right wing on this issue, as he already has on the issue of immigration and race in France, which is a depressing prospect. The ratification of the Mediterranean countries is no more certain because the Spanish Prime Minister has already said on their behalf, and it was said by the Portuguese in Maastricht, that their ratification will depend on more money coming forward for what is called cohesion and for structural funds, and they're talking in terms of sums which are far greater than certainly France or Germany or Britain seem prepared to provide, and I'm interested to see that the Right Honourable Gentleman who was at Maastricht for the Foreign Office seems to agree with me on that, with all his deep knowledge of the Spanish people in the countryside. But I think the biggest challenges to Maastricht will come as they came to the Werner Plan in developments outside the present European community itself. It is now clear that almost certainly all the EFTA countries, except perhaps Iceland, will want to join the community, probably will all be members well before 1996, which is the earliest date for Phase 3 of EMU. And this in itself will mean an enormous shift in the centre of gravity in Europe towards the north, something which we, I think, in Britain should heartily welcome, because in our approach to many issues, at least we on our side of the house have a great deal in common with the countries of Northern Europe. And I must say, if things go well, it seems to me that certainly by the end of the century, if not by the earlier date of 1997, it may be possible to form a single currency to which Germany, France, the Benelux countries, and Denmark and the EFTA countries will be members. In such a case, it seems to me inconceivable and well nigh insane to imagine that Britain would stand out. And all of us must have been deeply disturbed at the Chancellor's refusal this afternoon to answer the question, yes, we agree that Parliament must take the final decision, but what decision will he recommend in those circumstances?
He doesn't know.
Oh, he knows very well, because he told us earlier he's against a single currency in principle, like his predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Blaby, who's expressed his views, which I think are shared by the present Chancellor very clearly in an article in one of the tabloid newspapers, I believe the Evening Standard.
I wonder from...
Now, if I
just
may...
on that point.
Yes.
When he was saying what the Chancellor view was, but when we asked him this question in the Select Committee, I think what came clear was that he wasn't so much that he was against it in principle, but that he wasn't really certain in his own mind what he ought to do.
Well, he sounds exactly rather like a liberal, but I don't like to explore the murky recesses of the Chancellor's mind. But I must confess his failure to give any answer, even that answer, to the question this afternoon was, I thought, very significant. But the EFTA countries are not alone. I agree with all the Right Honourable and Honourable members, and I think they've almost all made this point who have spoken so far. It's very important to give Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Poland the prospect of joining the community at least by the end of this decade, and to give them every possible assistance in meeting the economic and political conditions for membership as soon as possible. And this, of course, will mean a big shift of gravity inside the community to the east. So by the end of the decade, power will have shifted to Central and Northeast Europe from its present location, which I suppose is somewhere between London, France, and Rome. Well, I accept that, though I gather that even the German Parliament is deeply divided on how much of it and how much of the government should move from Bonn to Berlin. But the biggest challenges, I think, to the Maastricht process will come, as they did earlier, from outside Europe altogether. The United States is clearly already becoming much more self-centred, and if partly because of Europe's obduracy over the CAP, the GATT talks break down, this process of disengagement from external responsibilities may move very much faster than anybody expects or hopes, both from Europe and from the West Pacific area. But the most important single factor is the disappearance of the Soviet Union from the world stage. Lenin, who doesn't often get a kind word these days, was right in at least one of the prophecies he made. He prophesied that the triumph of communism would lead to the withering away of the state. Well, I don't think anybody's ever seen a state wither away quite so fast as the Soviet state has in recent weeks. But the disappearance of the Soviet Union will have very disturbing consequences. It has been replaced by a Commonwealth of independent states. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if NATO, as I believe, is a biological monstrosity because it's an organ without a function, the Commonwealth of Independent States is a political nightmare because it's a function without an organ. It has at the moment absolutely no institutions through which to express itself. And it's worth remembering the lessons of history here, even the recent lessons. The disintegration of the European empires after the last war was followed by 45 years of armed conflict in the ex-colonies in which 20 million people have died. In the Far East, in the Indian subcontinent, in the Middle East, in Africa, even in the Caribbean. And all these factors are likely to be at work now that the Soviet Empire has disintegrated. Even worse, the European empires left behind them at least working administrative structures and moderately healthy economies, which meant that most of the ex-colonial countries have managed to maintain stable states and thriving economies, not thriving as fast, of course, of us in the West. But the Soviet Empire is leaving no administration behind it at all, and economic catastrophe. Because, as is often said, it's not very easy to turn an omelette back into eggs. And since the perestroika process began, the Soviet economy has followed a steady course downwards, and there seems no prospect at the moment of it reversing that process. We shall all be watching the success of Mr. Yeltsin's program, if it is introduced in January, to form a judgment on that. Now, if there's an economic catastrophe added to this political disintegration, the consequences for Europe could be dire. Not only the millions of refugees who are already predicted, but possibly the sale of nuclear weapons to any body of people or any government in the Third World or elsewhere which has hard currency to pay for them. I don't believe in a nuclear civil war in the Soviet Union. I think Nazarbayev and Kravchuk want to hang on to their nuclear weapons as a defense against Russian attack. And I don't think they have any intention of using them, nor have the Russians. But I think the risk that as the system disintegrates, people may simply sell off the smaller nuclear weapons is a real one, and I was glad to see it was recognized by Mr. Baker on his recent visit to the Soviet Union. These pose enormous threats to Western Europe, more immediate threats to Eastern Europe, but there's still no obvious way in which the West can help to avoid these consequences until there is at least some clarity about where authority lies in the Soviet Union, and I agree, I think it was with the member for Carshalton, who said that by far the most useful thing we could do in the short run would be to fund a payments union among the Commonwealth of Independent States so that they could at least have currencies with which they could trade with one another. But quite frankly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, against this background, and I doubt if many members of the House would dispute the dangers which I've outlined, the argument about who won at Maastricht is pitifully irrelevant. Maastricht was not a triumph for any government, although each of the governments present claims it as a triumph. Least of all was it a triumph for the British Prime Minister. I was interested to see that the Financial Times and the Spectator both picked the same phrase. They described it as a Pyrrhic victory. But the Prime Minister, of course, has produced some novel marriages, some very strange bedfellows. The last Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Filtree, said she was thrilled by the Prime Minister's success at Maastricht. My dear friend, if I may so describe him, the last Foreign Secretary who resigned over Europe from the Right Honourable Lady's government was equally thrilled, although he didn't express himself, he never does, in quite such colourful language. And to complete this glorious trinity, my Right Honourable friend, the member for Chesterfield, joined the throng during this debate. But I don't think there's very much we can be proud about that the Prime Minister has relegated Britain to a second division of countries which can only survive through having low pay because they have low skills. He obviously sees Britain as a sweatshop of the world. Indeed, he almost said as much. Indeed, we may soon, if we were unlucky enough to find him in office for more than a few months, find ourselves taking the place previously occupied by the Soviet Union as Upper Volta with rockets. In fact, the only significant critic, and I use the word significant with meaning, is the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Chingford, who, in spite everything the whips have been able to say to him, apparently still intends to vote against the government in the lobby tomorrow. He glares at me, stares at me impassively, but certainly didn't shake his head. But then, as the Right Honourable Member Sidcup said, he is a ghastly man. Perhaps more worrying to the government is the attitude of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, who was reported in an impeccably conservative newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, in a most reliable column by a gossip a writer called Peterborough, as saying that it would have been better if there had been no deal at all. I suspect the Prime Minister, indeed the rest of the front bench, will agree with what our great national poet William Shakespeare had to say on this matter. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do think the time has come at which the Prime Minister should stop playing Conservative Party politics with these issues and rise to the real level of the challenges which confront us in Britain, everyone in Europe, indeed every inhabitant of the planet. I understand very well that if you're driving a car and sitting behind you is a lady with a handbag and a man with fangs, you may feel it wiser to drive in the slow lane. My own advice, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that he should pull into a lay-by. Turf the others out and then hand the wheel over. Firmer and safer.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, thank you. Such was a ringing applause for the speech of the Right Honourable Gentleman. It wasn't possible to hear you call my name. But I am grateful, and also grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman. The applause that rang to the House at his, as usual, vintage performance, with many justified facts and views therein, was received very warmly in all parts of the House, not only the humour, but some of the other more sombre things he said about the ominous geopolitical appearance of the whole of Europe at the moment. That too, I think, reinforces the lesson and message, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of the whole meaning and significance of the Maastricht Summit, that the greater cohesion and unity of the European community is even more indispensable to the solving of its own internal economic, social and political problems, and to helping to solve the problems of the rest of Europe as well. And I was myself, as chairman of the European movement in Britain, extremely gratified to observe that a treaty which I would describe as very extensive and profound has at long last been signed. We ourselves in this House and in the British press have been understandably very preoccupied with the